I think what else was interesting was that Rachel Lim was a Singaporean that was kind of like co-hosting with Sam Altman. So she's part of the OpenAI team. I thought the key phrase that they had that became the headline was very much about how humanity must co-evolve with artificial intelligence. And I thought that was a very striking statement. But I think obviously there's a sense of a generational shift, right? An evolutionary term, paradigm shift of further evolution, right? And as if there's a species or some kind of like accelerant to evolution itself, right? Welcome to Brave. Learn from Southeast Asia's best tech leaders. Build the future, learn from our past, and stay human in between. No BS on success. I'm Jeremy Au, venture capitalist, serial founder, Harvard MBA, science fiction nerd, and dad of 2 daughters. Every week, we debate startup news, interview changemakers, answer listener questions, and share personal insights. Join our movement of over 20,000 members and get transcripts, resources, and community at www.bravesea.com. Do you manage your own IT for distributed teams in Asia? You know how painful it is. Accelerant helps your in-house team by taking tough tasks off their hands and giving them the tools to manage IT effectively. Get help across 8 countries in Asia Pacific, which includes onboarding, procurement, device management, real-time IT support, offboarding, and more. Gain full control of all your IT infrastructure in one place with our state-of-the-art platform. Check out Accelerant, ESEVEL.com, and get a demo today. Use our referral code BRAVE for 3 months free. Terms and conditions apply. Morning, Shiyan.
Good morning for me. It's good evening for you.
Well, it always works out somehow, but here we are across time zones, and really excited for this episode. So I think we have 2 major topics. First of all is talking very much about OpenAI's visit to Singapore and Jakarta. So talking a little bit about that and what it means for Southeast Asia and some of the topics it covered. And of course, secondly, we have had a recent report discussing kind of like founder stress and burnout and some of the quantitative numbers about something that we know quite well qualitatively. On that note, just want to quickly do a shout out to Anthony from Trial Capital, a partner and who's someone who's excited about Indonesia and Singapore and gave us lots of good feedback about our buddy Charisma. And so I think we'll try to incorporate that moving forward. So shout out to you, Anthony. Second person to shout out for is for Chu Yilin for recommending the Startup Snapshot report on founder stress. It was a tremendous recommendation. So definitely good fodder for a conversation. So if you're a listener and you're tuning in, feel free to email or WhatsApp or smoke signal to us, something for us to chew or digest or answer on your behalf. On that note, Shiyan, want to chat a little bit more about OpenAI in Singapore and Jakarta?
Probably a lot of our listeners are aware Sam Altman and OpenAI were in town on the 13th, and they did sort of a series of meetings, but also an open forum, I think with 1,000 plus attendees, where he took audience questions and did a little bit of a small talk. And it's kind of part of this extended, I think, like 16-city world tour where they're kind of going around meeting developers, kind of sharing their vision and telling their story about what is OpenAI up to. It's not the scary boogeyman, inviting regulation, and more conversation really around what's happening in that field. So I wasn't there myself, but I do have several friends who are attending. And so it kind of gave me a little bit of color on the conversation. And I think it is what's top of mind for people who are working in the field, whether they be regulators or startups and other technologists. And so I think it's interesting that he's in Singapore and Jakarta. I think Singapore is sort of like the nucleus of Southeast Asian like tech and policy. He was hosted by AISG, and they were moderating the conversation. And so I think folks are kind of eager to be part of that conversation and think about also how do we ensure that a lot of these foundation models are not only trained on Western data points, but also incorporate local data, local language, local norms as well. And so I think that is also part of what regulators are thinking about, in addition to just regulating the output, is also thinking about what's the input. And so if you think about like increasingly people are incorporating ChatGPT, Anthropic, other models into their workflows, what else can people do to continue to like localize, improve the results, and actually build something that's useful for humanity? And so I think that's like a pretty interesting like set of questions for people to consider as they're building.
Yeah, I think the simple fact is that he chose to go to Singapore and Jakarta is actually quite revealing, right, in terms of his priorities as well, for Japan, for the US, and Europe to make, I think, a certain set of conversation and talking points. I think tracking his consistency of his message is actually quite clear to me that there are two major talking points that he's doing a lot to emphasize. The first, of course, is that he's actually pro regulation, which is, I think, quite an actual proactive stance. Actually, I think is quite uncommon, I think, for early stage founders. For a company that obviously has grown tremendously, there's a lot of regulatory action, but I think this is probably like from product public launch to doing a global tour to really advocate for regulation consistently is
Well, there's a
interesting.
cynical perspective to that, right? Which is like, now that we're public, let's regulate and keep everyone else slower or down. And I haven't seen a ton of specifics on what that regulation would look like. I think it plays well to regulators to say, like, hey, look, we're so open, come regulate us. But at the same time, I think there was a draft of the European proposed regulations. And he's like, yeah, we're going to try to meet them. But if we cannot, then we'll just shut down in Europe. Right. So that's also like a double edged sword, right? Which is like, yeah, you want to regulate, but if you want your people to have access to this stuff, you need to regulate in a way that allows us to still operate. Right.
Yeah. And I think what was interesting is that we've seen this kind of regulatory differentiation, but also arbitrage play out. And I think one of the interesting analysis that I was reading was that I think the country that ends up being the most, you can say, permissive or lax, depending on which side you take on AI, data, and usage, will end up becoming a hub for AI companies. I think there's a very interesting dynamic, right? And I think we saw that to some extent actually with crypto, where there was in Singapore a more permissive regime on crypto. And so we saw Singapore become a crypto hub. And now we've seen that with the
Well,
recent,
no, no, no.
yeah.
So I would push back on that, right? Which I don't
Yeah.
think it was permissive. I think they were just clearer.
Yeah.
So for a long period of time, the SEC didn't say anything.
Okay. That's a fair point.
So
Yeah.
then it was like, people were like, well, is this a security? Does this pass the Howey test? Like, there's a lot of like, and so I think MAS was on the forefront of like defining things more clearly up front and creating a process for people to do it. And
Mhm.
so people came, but I don't actually think it was like permissive. And I think you see that in the flow of companies to Hong Kong and to Dubai, because where MAS came down pretty strongly was around like advertising. So
Right.
they shut off all the advertising to consumers, to retail
Yeah.
customers, essentially by crypto, which really shut off a lot of growth for people. And so I think there's two things, right? Which is like, one, you want a reasonable set of rules to play by that are articulated so you can continue. And you don't want like arbitrarily something will come down and say, hey, you're not allowed to do this. And you're like, but you didn't tell me. So I think that's a little bit part of the play here, right? Which is like, engage regulators early so you can set out some rules of the road so you can continue, because you think there is a potential that down the line regulators could go too far and overreact, and that uncertainty is worse for you, right? So
Yeah.
you can like proactively co-write regulation together rather than say, hey, I'm going to be a cowboy and then someone's going to come and smack me.
Yeah, I think what else was interesting was that Rachel Lim was a Singaporean that was kind of like co-hosting with Sam Altman. So she's part of the OpenAI team. She's I believe, a Raffles Junior College alumnus. So kind of interesting to see that dynamic that's there. So some local representation on the stage. I thought the key phrase that they had that became a headline was very much about how humanity must co-evolve with artificial intelligence. And I thought that was a very striking statement. I think co-evolve, I don't know whether it was ad-libbed or was that prepared. But I think obviously there's, I think, a sense of a generational shift, right? An evolutionary term, paradigm shift of further evolution, right? And as if there's a species or some kind of like accelerant to, I don't know, evolution itself, right? So I thought it was an interesting dynamic
I
to
mean,
say. Yeah.
it's it's kind of true, right? Like if you think about it, how our human brains have evolved, like 100 years is actually not a lot of time in evolutionary time scale, right? But you think about what has happened in the last 100 years in terms of access to information, how we consume things, it has been a huge change. And it's not clear that people have actually trained themselves to harness it more effectively. It's like why like access to processed foods and sugar just makes people fatter. It doesn't like reduce global hunger. It just makes people who have access even fatter. Because like your body is tuned to say like I want that delicious sugar and fat.
So humanity must co-evolve with McDonald's.
Yeah. No, but like I think that's like it's like a totally good point,
Yeah.
right? Which is like
Yeah.
in one sense, you know, you could say, wow, we have the internet now. Everyone on Earth with like an internet connection, a cell phone, has access to like more information than anybody in all of history.
Right.
But what does that actually happen? Does that actually lead to like more people becoming educated, more people becoming enlightened? Or does it just lead to like larger and larger consumption of our day with entertainment and being like broadcast stuff into our heads? Right? And so now
Yeah.
you're at this next stage of like co-piloting with AI, and that's going to like transform a lot of our workflows. How do we co-evolve with people so that they don't just blindly do whatever the AI tells them? Like we already had that first case of the lawyer who submitted totally fake cases generated by ChatGPT, and he was like, "Oh, I didn't know that it could hallucinate."
Well, it happens all the time. I mean, that's what happens for the 737 MAX, right? It's just like you have all these pilots, obviously it's so autopiloted, and then without sufficient training, basically the co-pilot, that's the system, ends up becoming an autopilot, and the autopilot sometimes doesn't work, right? So I think, I actually think something this, right? I think everyone in AI is using the word co to really hide something. Like whenever they say something all the time, you always have to watch out because they're trying to hide something's the opposite. And what I'm noticing a lot for AI stuff is they're using a lot of the word co. So co-pilot, because they're saying we're not removing control, it's a co-pilot, it's co-evolve. So this co word is coming up over and over again, basically to imply that there's a shared status, right? There's a peer, right? And I'm just saying, like, I think, like you said, I think there's going to be a lot of autopilot folks. There's a lot of people automatic, but I think it's only a matter of time before.
So I think the
Yeah.
737 MAX is a really interesting example, right? Because that bug, right, that caused the plane crashes, it had actually been reported before, but it had been reported in incidents that were not fatal. And the fatal incidents actually were in budget airlines that had, I think, pretty deliberately tried to reduce the amount of training in order to increase the supply of pilots to staff their flights. And so, yeah, like if people try to take shortcuts like that, right? It's sort of like co-pilots work for like the 2 standard deviation, right? Like amount of instances, but you actually need to have like better judgment and more expertise for the tails. But in that moment when the tail happens and you didn't train the person enough, right, then you're screwed. So I think that maybe you say co-evolve is to hide something, but I think co-evolve is actually an important word to say like, hey, you can't just abdicate all responsibility to the AI. Like you actually have to put effort into thinking about how people should interact with this in a responsible way.
I think capital and asset owners are trying to like scale, and I'm going to make the air sound. And the reason why there's the air sound is because you make it sound as if individuals get to choose to be on a peer basis. But I think a lot of asset owners are basically saying, how do I rebuild this business model where it's mostly AI and some humans, which makes sense. I mean, it's like a factory model, right? The industrialization of production of content. And I just think that for a lot of folks, I think there's going to be a lot of effect where folks are going to be churned out because of these productivity improvements effectively taking over their jobs. And one discussion I was having, I was at the ACE Awards Gala. I received a nice award for, I guess, ACE age 35
You're so fancy, Jeremy.
So fancy. But I thought it was a really interesting conversation I got to have a little bit because we're discussing about the political ramifications, right, of this. And what was interesting was that we had saw this giant wave of globalization where basically blue collar jobs was moved towards China. And obviously, China saw the fastest rise in living incomes for poor folks, etc. But we also saw the hollowing out of the blue collar, middle America industrial class, right? And so that has dramatically reshaped the political coalition, right, of blue collar workers. So there's a weird alliance between business Democrats and business Republicans, but that was okay for different reasons. And so we saw that different change. But that was all, for blue collar, right? And now we have white collar professionals where I don't think they get a choice to be a co-pilot or not. I think a lot of their roles are going to get reduced, changed. And sure, eventually, I think in 10, 20, 30 years, we're all going to reskill ourselves in different roles. But I think there's going to be a lot of jobs that are just going to go away, right? I think we see the writer's strike is they are very insistent about the AI side of it. They're worried about their jobs being automated out to some extent. So I think there's this interesting dynamic where I think we're only seeing the very beginnings of this. Yeah, I don't think it's a co-pilot. I think it's mostly autopilot with some checks. Yeah.
Well, we should make a bet in 10 years.
On what? Like
what percent of jobs? Yeah. What percent of jobs have been automated away versus not? Maybe, okay, we will make the bet right now. And we should think about this for next week.
Well, the interesting part was that McKinsey actually did a report on what jobs will get automated away. That was done about a couple of years ago. And I thought it was a really good report. But they did not consider this at all. So actually, they wrote about how a lot of these professional jobs that require communication were a good skill to learn to avoid getting replaced by robots. And now I'm just laughing a little bit because this report has to be updated now. So now I'm wondering maybe the only job that's left is maybe celebrity and maybe doctor and the guilds, right? Lawyers, soldiers.
Yeah. I mean, there are auto-generated celebrities too.
Oh yeah, I met one today. Startups, and it was just, yeah, that's another thing altogether. For all the lonely people out there, you don't need to meet someone special. You can just have.
I mean, 100%, yeah, replica, $20 a month.
Yeah. I think China, some reports of folks who are falling in love with the AIs. I don't know. Interesting times, right? I think it'll be a countercultural movement. It was real humans, not AI. I don't know. I can't think of a catchy protest slogan yet.
No, it's just artisanal honey.
Yeah. Or organic humanity. I need to think of a good
handcrafted.
I need to think of a good UC Berkeley. We always had a lot of protest and free speech movement, right? It's the robots have gotta go. Down robots. I don't know. Someone
don't quit your day job, man.
Yeah, it's like ChatGPT. Can you please maybe some slogan writers, slogans for the anti-AI and anti-robot? I don't know. So I read this really interesting article in The Economist, and I think there's an opinion piece about how at the end of the day, this isn't actually artificial intelligence because it's not thinking, it's not conscious. But what it's done is it's hacked language, right? As a model, right? You and I'm conscious, you're conscious, but we communicate through these words that we hacked on top of our biology. And so for the first time, actually, you have non-intelligent beings in that sense who are able to talk like us. And so we look at language as a form of sentience and consciousness, but we look at dolphins and we look at monkeys and we look at pigs and they're 100% smart, but we're hey, you don't speak English and you can't put an apostrophe where it needs to go. So guess what? You don't count, right? So I think there's an interesting dynamic where, at the end of the day, these language models are not really consciousness, but they're actually just statistical probability language. But yet, I think it's so good and it's already good enough that people are falling in love with it, starting to raise AI little kids. It's just kind of bonkers to see that. I think that's why I think it's really transformational because it's not about intelligence, right? It's about language generation from my perspective.
I've always said my dog was smarter than my kids until about the age of 2.
So ChatGPT 4 at the age of what? 2 is how much smarter than your kids and the dog?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, but the dog, you never have to spend time convincing it to go to sleep.
Yeah.
You don't have to feed the dog. The dog kind of knew how to eat kind of from day one. It was really fast to potty train. Dog follows directions. Yeah, I mean, pre-2, the dog is actually outperforming. We always tell the kids, hey, Toaster is the best child, the most obedient child.
My favorite use case of ChatGPT so far has someone said, please pretend to be a loving spouse.
Do you process
So-
your comments through this before you talk to your wife?
So he was telling me that basically like he has a long day at work, right? And the wife doesn't want to hear whatever he's saying. So he just writes to ChatGPT like, oh, I had a tough day at work and blah, 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 blah. And ChatGPT is like, oh, sorry, dear. How are you feeling about that? He just, and then he like processes that on his cab ride home. And then he's like, kind of like doesn't do that data dump to the spouse. And I'm like, that's hilarious because it's somewhere between a therapist and a really good friend, i.e., a spouse, maybe. But I don't know. It was
I
just,
can't decide how I feel about that.
I know it's
But then
interesting.
does it just reduce the resolution of conversation you have with your spouse, or it's just sort of like you think your spouse is not interested in it, so you're like creating space to have conversation about things that they're interested in?
Oh, is this emotional cheating? Like
Oh, I don't know. I think cheating is a hard word. Like that's a pretty harsh word, but I don't know. That's kind of interesting, right? Like, well, I mean, I guess you have different friends who serve different functions in your life, right? Like you
Yeah,
might have
exactly.
sports friends or
yeah,
business friends or whatever it is. Interesting.
adultery with the chatbot. And you know what? It's not impossible. I think flat out. I think there's definitely a headline that's going to happen in the next 5 years.
No, I think in Replica
Yeah.
they've already talked about it.
Yeah.
That people use their Replica friends to
Yeah.
emotionally process things, and it
Yeah.
can feel like emotional cheating. You know, there are also positive use cases where it's like, hey, it actually helped them think about how they were relating to their spouse and do it better. Even
Yeah.
if it did start as like a venting thing.
Yeah. Talking about venting and stress and processing your feelings. So speaking about processing feelings and feeling stressed out about life, we had an interesting report called Startup Snapshot, which is available and linked in the transcript on the podcast. But here's some key statistics about how founders are processing mental health. So I thought it was interesting to see about how they said 72% of founders report that there's a negative impact on their mental health. 81% of founders are not really open about the stress, fears, and challenges. And I thought my favorite two pieces of that was like only 23% of founders go to a psychologist or a coach to talk about those feelings. And only 10% of founders turn to their investors to talk about their stress. Yeah.
I often feel that part of my job is being a therapist.
But to only 10% of them. So if you were truly trusted by everybody, you could have 10 times more of those
Do I want 10 times more?
You see, people can feel the energy, so they don't want to give it to you. But I think it's totally fair, right? I mean, the truth is, it's tough, right? I mean, when I was a founder, I honestly trusted some investors more than other investors, right? And even for the investors I did trust, obviously I was thoughtful about, hey, I only have 1 hour a week, right, to process some stuff, maybe 1 hour a month, right? And so am I really going to be talking about my feelings, right? I'll rather just talk about work or the decisions. There's so many things to talk about. So I was definitely stressed as a founder. And yeah, I think I'll probably put myself in one of those buckets of, I was one of the 90% who did not talk to my investor about my stress.
I think it comes out in different ways, right? It's not like they call you intending to talk about their stress. It's more like you talk about the business and then you can kind of sense that they're a little bit down. And so you kind of do a check in and you're like, hey, how are you feeling? Like, what's going on with you? And kind of normalize it because, you know, what we tell people when we write the first check is like, hey, most of the time in a startup, things are kind of going badly. So you don't need to put up a front for us, right? You don't have to pretend like everything is up and to the right and crushing it because that's just not normally the state of affairs. And so it's kind of giving people permission, like establishing that social contract to say, like, it's okay to be like, it's not going that well. It doesn't mean it's the end of the world. It just means like you got to figure out how to solve something locally or whatever it is. But I would say like 90% of the time you kind of feel like things are not going well. Something's always on fire, right?
Something's always on fire. That's 100%, right? And I think here's some numbers here, right? They're saying like out of like 100% of the founders, 44% have high stress, 37% have anxiety, 36% have burnout, 13% have depression, and 10% have panic attacks. So that's actually a pretty sizable chunk. I mean, the way I think about it is like, yeah, half of the folks therefore are stressed out, and 1/3 have anxiety or burnout, right? And 1 in 10 have depression.
Yeah.
So I
I
don't
mean, I
think it's an
think
easy
they
journey.
also don't take care of themselves, right? Like they
Yeah.
overeat or they drink or they don't sleep enough or they're not exercising, right? And so all those things I think are actually really important for being able to go the distance. Like
Yeah.
you need to have strong emotional resilience, but your body needs to feel good. So like you do need to sleep, you need to exercise, and you need to like have places where you can like hang out with people and connect with people who matter to you. Because the worst is also if like things are going badly on the home front, right? Like
Yeah.
if your spouse is mad at you because you're not spending enough time or they feel like you're absent, then yeah, it can just be bad news bears all around.
Yeah, I remember my spouse was, then girlfriend was frustrated with me because she was like, Jeremy, you're not taking care of yourself, right? You're not taking a haircut, you're not shaving, right? You're putting on weight, you're stressed out all the time, you can only talk about work. And I was like, sat down and I was like, yeah, because all I think about is work. That's why I can't talk about anything else other than work. It was terrible. And I think it was quite validating to see the report to be like, oh, okay, thank goodness. It's like, it looks like, yeah, 59% of founders sleep less since starting a startup. It's like, oh, I don't feel like I'm part of the minority, right?
Yeah, but I mean, I think that's why co-founders are really important.
Yeah.
Because having someone who like really understands what's going on. I think it's hard for your spouse because they're kind of like not in it, right? They're sort of, I mean, they're forced to endure it, but they're not in it the way like a co-founder is. And having co-founders who can like balance you out and sort of also laugh, I think is like super important. So I don't know. I just remember in the early days of NerdWallet, we would like work and then we would all work out together. We would like exercise.
It's like the only word difference is the word out. Sorry.
Yeah. So it's like we'd be in the
Yeah.
office and then like there were like 10 of us or whatever. And we shared like, we went to the same exercise class. And we all work out. And then we would all eat like greasy Chinese food together. And then we go to bed and we like start all over again the next day. It was awesome.
Yeah. See, I missed out the step about exercising. So I would just work. I'll drink Soylent for lunch. I would eat.
Oh,
I know it's
disgusting.
terrible. It was terrible in retrospect, but I used to chug like caffeinated Soylent.
Oh.
Yeah, I created it next to my
What
desk.
kind of Singaporean are you? That
Well,
you would even
I was
allow Soylent into your body. Oh,
I
gross.
know. I was one of those. Yeah. And then I would dinner. I would get home and then I'll order like a platter of sushi. I want to work out. So I gained 20 kilograms actually. So I gained from a normal weight. I became medically obese by American standards, not by Asian BMI standards. It was just horrible actually. And then I remember after I sold the company and then I did my physical, and then basically my blood results were like, oh, you're pre-diabetic, you're pre-hypertension, you have
Oh no.
bad cholesterol, you have no vitamin D, you have bad testosterone, you are obese. And I was just like, look at your liver enzymes are terrible. And I was just like, look at this thing. And I got this report. I remember I was in line for a ramen shop in New York. And I was just like so sad. And I walked out of the line for this Michelin star ramen shop. And then I remember I walked to a dim sum shop and got some like steam stuff. And I was just like, such an abysmal thing. I was like, oh, I finally have time to do a health physical, and I got these terrible results. I kind of knew it was happening. Yeah.
It's okay. Now you've got yourself on track, right?
Yeah, because I'm
You're
on
back
venture
to
capital now.
your svelte form.
Yeah, I know, because it's much less stressful. And I think there's a lot more control, right? I think. And I think obviously I have the benefit of a good social support network as well now. I think I'm much more intentional now. Like I have to sleep harder in terms of like melatonin and the valerian root and the soap, the pillow and all this stuff. I don't know.
Weighted
It's
blanket,
crazy.
man.
Yeah, I got a weighted
All
blanket
about
as well.
the weighted blanket.
I know, right? And then, yeah. So I think another thing that we talked about a little bit was also, 42% of founders report the fear of failure as the major source of stress. I thought that was a really interesting number. And I thought it was interesting because actually over the past week, I actually hosted the Phoenix offsite. So basically it's a virtual offsite for founders that are moving on to the next chapter in their life because they exited their startup, because they had to wind it down, because it's a co-founder departure. And so we had about kind of like a dozen folks just kind of like discussing about their feelings. And really, I think it was interesting to see that the language about what is success or failure was a really, really tough thing. And I think one person framed it up as like, okay, so you're successful, you become a unicorn, and I'm not that, right? For whatever reason. So I'm a failure. Is that right? And then I was like, whoa, like based on statistics. But that's a statistic on a company level. But to embed company success versus personal failure was an interesting, I don't know what, dichotomy, right? And so I think there's an interesting dynamic between what the right language is for founders.
Well, do they think about it as a one shot, or they kind of want to keep playing the game? Like they want to take more shots on goal?
I think they're just thinking about the last shot, the last game, right? And all the various mistakes or things they did well. So I think a lot of emotional processing and also processing of the facts and the different circumstances. So I don't think they're thinking too hard, honestly, for the cohort of founders that I was coaching. Wasn't thinking too hard about what's happening. Yeah, I mean, it's just one step down the road, right? Before they can process that.
You talk to a lot of founders in the Valley, and it's a funny thing, right? You kind of need to have two things in your head simultaneously. One is like you kind of know that the probability of getting a unicorn is pretty low, but at the same time, you think you can do it, right? That's why you're doing it. And you feel you love being in the game. And so even if this shot isn't the unicorn, right? You sell it, it's not an amazing outcome, whatever it is, you still learned a lot, and you're going to take those learnings and roll it into the next shot because you're playing the game, right? And the game is like, I get to be in control of my destiny. I get to build cool stuff. I get to work with people I enjoy. And part of the game may be you can take breaks and go to Fang, big company, and rest for a little bit before coming out and playing again. The winning, I guess, or the success is more about the ability to play the game rather than necessarily generating a unicorn outcome every time you take a shot.
Yeah. I mean, I think that rhymes with another number in the report, which is about how 93% of founders would definitely or potentially start another venture despite feeling very stressed about the current venture. And I think that was actually a very strong sense as well, which is I think most founders in that group actually wanted to keep doing it because I think there's a real strong sense of autonomy, of control, of freedom, but also I think a strong sense of mission and purpose that. And so a lot of the questions were like, we did have a panel of founders who either built another startup or joined corporate or became a VC. And a lot of the questions actually were about what you just said, which was like, hey, how should I think about doing another shot? How should I rest? Would I be accepted by a corporate, right, as a founder, right? And so there's, I think, an interesting dynamic of like, I don't know what's the word, like feeling awkward about whether they would fit in that corporate mold, right? And be able to join that. Yeah.
But I think also bigger companies, not necessarily corporate, but bigger later stage startups hiring former founders is great. Because you kind of get
100%.
someone who's like, hey, I know how to make things happen with limited resources. And here I am, I'm a bigger company. I can give them some resources, right? Like
Right.
they don't need to go and raise money themselves. You're saying like, hey, run with it. Go make stuff happen.
Yeah.
And those can be really amazing for culture, especially if you're bigger, maybe like things have slowed down a little bit. You're not feeling as much of that go, go, go urgency. You can kind of inject these people into an organization. So you're not going full on like, I don't know, working for Acme Paper Company or whatever, but something that's still sort of in a tech related innovation space.
Yeah, I think it's a tricky thing. And I think the companies that are willing to be change oriented and trying to fight for the future, I think absorb founders better. I think there are a lot of companies, obviously, that are more focused about preserving the status quo, right? And I think that it's not going to be a culture match, let alone be a role opening for someone.
Oh yeah, I mean it'll be very frustrating, right?
Yeah. I think there is, a stigma still around, I think, obviously founder failure, right? I think Southeast Asia got into that first wave of like now founders are a profession and a career. But I think the stigma around failure, and I think definitely also varies across the region. I think there's a sense that I think Singapore is getting a bit better, but I think it's still pretty tough in Indonesia and Vietnam right now because they don't have that wave, right, of startup success and failure and the recycling of that talent across the ecosystem. So I thought it was interesting to hear from folks in the ecosystem be like, oh, like I can't find a job here in my local who was able to understand this, right? And I thought it was not an easy part, right? I mean, Singapore wasn't hospitable 10 years ago for a lot of these talent as well, right? So,
but now there's more other startups too, right? So you should have like a bigger base of places to kind of recruit into.
Yeah, but a lot of startups are also kind of like struggling as well. So interesting.
Was there a good conversation kind of like reflecting on like what they would have done differently, or kind of like what were their learnings or takeaways from the past experience?
I mean, I think it's long story short is no. I also don't think it was the right space to do so. Because even for myself, like for my two companies, obviously, it took time for me to be like, okay, these are the things I did awesome and these are the things I didn't do great on, right? And it took me, honestly, I think for both companies, took me 2 years, I think, to fully process and kind of like get that full learning, right? So I would actually have
It's
Google
too raw,
documents.
you're saying?
I think you just need space and time, right? And yeah, I did well and it was okay, right? But still, there were things I would have done differently. And I have Google Docs, right, for each company where I'm just like, this, it's weird, right? It's like both of them are about 10 pages long, right? But these are the bullet points, right? It's like, these are things I did well on. These are things that I could have done differently. These are the reasons why I did them wrong at a fundamental level, right? So then there's a little bit recursive and I'm like leaving comments on my stuff. Yeah.
Would you share like some of those learnings? Like if you were going to start a third company, like kind of what principles would you bring into it?
I think for the first company, I think what I learned was that I learned that for myself, we were a consultancy selling to the social sector, and then we were a consultancy that started selling to government. And what I learned about this was that I felt like selling to government was something that didn't find myself to have a lot of energy in, right? And so that was a personal realization. And when I realized that, that's unlocked me to go find a successor to do that, right? And so I think, but I kind of did that strategy without knowing that. It was just a discovery process. It wasn't a bad thing. It wasn't a good thing. But it's just like, that's not my thing to sell giant projects in that sense, right? Even though I think Singapore government is probably like one of the best governments to work with. And I think they're tremendous people. But I'm just saying like, that wasn't my energy sweet spot, right? At that point of time. Second company, I think one big difference I would do differently was just like thinking about the long term, right? I think I enjoyed education tech and I really enjoyed the startup journey. It's just that I was building it in America and my heart was in Southeast Asia, right? In Singapore, right? And so there's this interesting geographic realization to be like, oh, I would like to be home. I know this sounds kind of cheesy, but I was like, yeah, I miss home, right? I miss my parents, I miss my sister, I miss my friends. So I think it was an interesting dynamic, right? So I was like, oh, I'm glad if I was to build something, I would build this out of Southeast Asia, right? But I think it's non-obvious, right? Until you do it. So these are all realizations that takes time to process. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you for sharing.
Yeah. How about you? When you think about it, obviously you help a lot of founders, right? Go through both the success stage, but also go through the failure stage in terms of winding down or moving on to the next chapter as well. So how have you tried to help, or how have you tried to help them process?
I mean, I think the wind down thing is like pretty rough, right? Because there's like the personal sort of how you feel about it, and then there's just all the like paperwork and cat herding. And so the whole thing is kind of like not that fun. And so I think part of it is like not giving permission necessarily, but sort of saying like, because they kind of feel bad, right? So they wanted to win, they wanted to make you a ton of money, and now they're winding down and they've lost all your money, or they'll go use cents on the dollar or something, right? So it's like no one's like excited about this outcome. And part of it is like being able to say like, hey man, it's okay. Note to founders, this doesn't mean you should set my money on fire, but if you made a good faith effort, you behaved with integrity, you tried hard, and you like treat everyone well on the way down, like that's all we can ask for as investors, right? Like we know the asset class we're in, we know the risks we're taking, and it doesn't mean that we're not going to back you on your next thing, right? So it's kind of like how you conduct yourself in that moment, I think also determines how your investors see you and like, do you get to play the game again? And so some of it, a little bit, is just like, sometimes people are like, I'm so sorry, like, I really wanted to make money and da 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 da. And you're like, yeah, this isn't the outcome we wanted. Like, I appreciate you treating everyone fairly. I appreciate you communicating well and like doing this in a good way. And give yourself that space and permission to like take some time off before you kind of go rush into something else. And just kind of talking them through that, right? So I think on the sort of like wind down side, that's kind of where it is. On the stress side, I think when I do see founders getting burnt out, I will check when I say, when's the last time you took a vacation? And they'll be like, I don't have time for a vacation.
Yeah,
Like,
totally. That's what I was thinking, dude. That's the answer, yeah.
and you're like, but you don't have time to be burnt out either.
I do not give myself permission to be burnt out.
Yeah, but it's sort of just like
Yeah.
saying like, hey, I want you to go take a weekend off.
Yeah.
And don't like literally tell everyone you're turning off. Like, you're not going to check your email, and just rest. Bring a book, bring a journal, but don't. You just have to do it. And I know this feeling. I like when I was in the thick of it, my coach was like, please just take 4 hours today and go away. Like, go for a hike.
Yeah.
Because, it was just too much. I was like, I have too many things to do. I cannot take a day off. And my coach is like, you have to. 4 hours. Just go for a hike. Yeah, I know it sounds crazy, right? And then when you do it and you actually free your brain to have some new thoughts, you're like, oh my God, yes. Why didn't I do this?
Yeah.
And so sometimes it's just like reminding people to do that. And I think a corollary of that, especially in the remote world, is reminding founders to do it for their teams.
Right.
So like I told a founder, I was like, hey, you guys have been driving really hard for the last 12 months. You need to take your team on an offsite. And it shouldn't be super work focused. You guys should just have fun. Right. But like, you're going to burn your people out if you do this.
Right.
So yeah, I think sometimes it's just like reminding people, giving them permission, even though they didn't seek my permission, but just sort of normalizing it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's talking about hikes and that time out. I think one of the things that I shared was that I think if you are a founder who's departing for a new chapter, this is a great opportunity to go off the grid, right? So after my first company, I went for a Vipassana retreat. That's like 10 days silent meditation, no talking. I went with my co-founder. So it was interesting because we talked to each other all the time, and suddenly we're both like not talking to each other, but we're in the same space. Very conscious uncoupling, But and after that, I went on a hike.
You're such a hippie.
Don't tell anybody. And after that, I went on a hike on the Pacific Crest Trail from Los Angeles to Yosemite. And I was reading and listening to Wild by Cheryl Strayed.
Wait, how long is that? You hiked the PCT?
Yeah, for 1 month. Yeah. I mean, not the whole thing, but this 1 month.
That's so cool. I want to do that.
Yeah, I should totally do. And so I was talking with another founder in the Botanic Gardens, who was just going for a walk because he's departing a successful company. And actually, one of the conversations that we had was just like, hey, there's an opportunity to do like the Camino de Santiago, which is you walk from Spain to France. It's like a 1 month walk. The chance to take a train, right? For those long train rides across America, across Europe. All those things are like, I don't know, off the grid experiences that you get to do. It's a small window of opportunity to do, right? And I think giving yourself.
Did you hike by yourself for a month?
Well, I went with my then girlfriend, and who after that hike, I was like, oh, maybe she can be my fiance and eventual wife. So yeah, that was a nice moment to walk and hike for a month in a shared tent and all that stuff. It was great.
Wow.
Yeah, it was awesome. But then, of course, once we came back to nature, city, then we had an argument. And I was like, no, I was feeling so lovey-dovey for a month. And then the city, we had some squabble about something. And I was like, boo. And after that, I was like, oh, no, it's just fine.
Wait, did you get married? Is it your current wife or not?
Yes, it is my current wife.
Okay. That was confusing, which is like...
It's confusing. I was like, it was a good story, but it bad. No.
Yeah.
My now wife was who I hiked with the PCT with. And we were just a boyfriend, girlfriend at that point of time. Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah, it was fun. It paid off. Yeah. My funny story here, very quickly, is that to get out of the trailhead, you had to hitchhike. And I realized that having my wife be by the roadside hitchhiking, and then the car will slow down to pick her up, and I'll just jump out of the bushes effectively. And I'll be like, hey, there's two of us who need a hitchhike, right? So But no, I thought it was a wonderful hike. It was very restorative. And actually, that was the big difference because after my first company, I had that window of time. But for my second company, we sold in 2019 Q4. And then it was the pandemic right after that, right? So I just didn't have any of that space. But also, I mean, it was a terrible time of tragedy. And I was just glued to my TV, right? Seeing all this stuff. So it was just a very tough time, right? For everybody, right? So, yeah.
Well, I wanted to hike the Annapurna circuit for my honeymoon.
Ooh.
And my wife
happened?
was like, no. She's like, I want to have hot showers and a bed for my honeymoon. And I was like, yeah, that's reasonable.
Yeah. Well, that's why you can do the Camino de Santiago. You get to do that with the hot showers, right?
Yeah. So I've yet to hike the Annapurna circuit, but the PCT's on my list. I definitely want to do that.
I know. It's such a wonderful hike and it's beautiful. But
would you ever
definitely
do
a
the whole
hike.
thing?
I think there was a period of time when I wanted to section hike the rest of the Pacific Crest Trail. But now that I have kids, I kind of realized that that's not doable. Like, I mean, it's just a long chunk of time. You got to go to SF, the West Coast. So I think I'm hoping that maybe when my kids are teenagers, hopefully I can like have, I don't know, coach them in the ways of nature so that I have a new hiking buddy, I guess, maybe for the rest of the.
I have a friend who's hiking the PCT right now with his wife, but they're retired. This year, there's a lot of snow still because of all the rain and snow that happened over the winter. So they have to skip around to try to avoid the snow sections and then come back and do them later in the summer.
Yeah, thankfully I didn't have to do that during our time frame. So, well, on that note, anything else you want to kind of like think about or share to wrap up this episode?
I think the wrap up is everyone should just go outside, go for a hike, turn off, disconnect for a bit.
Don't let your replica model bother you while you're out in nature.
Yeah, don't do it.
Yeah. I think for me, I think the key takeaway is, I don't know, I think the word for me is humanity. I think it was interesting where I think there's humanity in the context of OpenAI and ChatGPT, also humanity in the face of like stress, right? I think that's the one word summary for me. Humanity.
Cool.
Awesome. Well, see you next week, Xuyen. Thank you for listening to Brave. If you enjoyed this episode, please share the podcast with your friends and colleagues. We would also appreciate you leaving a rating or review. Head over to www.bravesea.com for member content, resources, and community. Stay well and stay brave.